Well, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. So it was on this day in 1986 that Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer became the number one song. And to make things even more dramatic, it overtook his old friends in Genesis with their former number one song, Invisible Touch, from the album of the same name. Both Genesis and Peter were, of course, riding high in the mid-80s. But there are a lot of interesting things about the song Sledgehammer and the album So, from which it derives, beyond the fact that it's just a really good song and a really good album. Now, at the time, the production style of the 80s, some of the new instruments being used and the new recording techniques, and of course the ubiquity of MTV, all of that made the 80s music scene sound very futuristic. Things like the drum machine, the sampler, the sequencer, modern synthesizers, the arrival of digital synthesizers, the arrival of sampling keyboard-based synths like the Synclavier and the EMU emulator. Before that, it technically was released in the very late 70s, but made its mark in the 80s. The Fairlight CMI, of which Peter Gabriel was a very early exponent. The gated drum sound, again, that Peter Gabriel helped to invent with his old friend Phil Collins at the tail end of the 70s, a sound that went on to define the 80s. All of this sounded very, very futuristic at the time. So, for instance, if in the middle of the 80s you were to put on an album like So by Peter Gabriel, and contrast it with the production style of the Beatles' Abbey Road or of Led Zeppelin 1, you would say, this stuff from the 80s sounds very futuristic. Weirdly, though, you could also say the same comparing those legendary late 60s albums with something like A Flock of Seagulls. Without saying anything negative to them, because they wrote some great pop hits in the synth pop genre, a lot of 80s music, both the synth pop stuff and even some of the production on some of the rock stuff, sounds very dated because the pendulum always swings both ways. And when you swing very hard towards trying to sound as futuristic as possible, the next generation comes along and say, oh, well, that was the future then, but it's the past now. Where a more natural style of production that was prevalent in the 60s and 70s doesn't really have that same effect. The pendulum remains more in the middle. Now, Peter Gabriel has managed to avoid that because while his album So and Sledgehammer in particular has all of those things, sequencers, the most modern synthesizers of the day, that gated drum sound, and a very famous video with that wonderful claymation that was all over the MTV airwaves and elsewhere. Yet somehow, when you listen to So front to back, it doesn't sound dated like so many albums of that era do. And this shows that timeless composition and creative performance can really overcome the stereotypes of being typecast in hindsight to a particular era. In other words, even if there's someone who comes along and says, well, I don't really like 70s music, they probably like Bohemian Rhapsody. And even if someone says, oh, I don't like funky R&B music, they probably like some or all of the songs on Michael Jackson's Thriller. And even if someone says, oh, I hate album-oriented rock and stadium rock, they probably tap their foot and sing along when someone puts Journey's Don't Stop Believin' on. And what all of this shows is that when you do something that really is well written, well performed, it stands the test of time. And if it's particularly creative, I think that gives you an even bigger shot in terms of the odds of standing the test of time. Now, Peter Gabriel, as I alluded to earlier, helped to invent many of the sounds of the 80s. It was Phil Collins working on Peter Gabriel's third album when the gated drum sound was accidentally invented. Gabriel was one of the first people to experiment with the Fairlight CMI, a new synthesizer and sampler and sequencer all in one for the new decade. And this idea of this very clean production style, so clean to the point of almost not being natural of the 80s. Gabriel pioneered that too. But because It was his baby. He knew what to do with it creatively. It wasn't just an instance of some other producer coming around and say, oh, let's just copy that. And that might sound really cool and fresh in 1982, but by 92, 2002, or 2024, not so much. In terms of production, I would say that Peter Gabriel's records and the things that Trevor Horn produced really do stand the test of time, even though you would think they wouldn't, because those are quintessentially 80s albums. Between Peter Gabriel and what Trevor Horn was doing, this was the sonic palette of the 80s. But it has stood, or shall I say, withstood the test of time now that the 80s sound is thought of as almost being a hindrance to otherwise good music in terms of its production. I mean, David Gilmour, for instance, thought that his 1987 Pink Floyd, I put that in those because of the whole Roger Waters leaving the band. But that album was full of this 80s production style. And they took the stems to that album, the multi tracks, and what Gilmour said, they took the 80s out of it. So all of the gated effects on the drums, they replaced with a more natural sound. They put some of the synthesizers that were brand new at the time down in the mix and put things like Hammond organ and piano up in the mix. And because it seems as though the 80s production style was almost a source of embarrassment for Pink Floyd, or well, those members of Pink Floyd. But no such thing for Peter Gabriel because you couldn't really imagine so in any other context because everything was done so meticulously. Every sound, every turn of the knob on the console, every choice of instrument, every edit, every splice was done with a kind of perfection that Peter Gabriel is now infamous for. And history has shown that that really did pay off because unlike an album like Momentary Lapse of Reason where the 80s style was just done because hey, we're in the 80s, this was done for very important artistic reasons. And when you do something because you're blazing a trail rather than following the herd, you will always be an original. And that's why Sledgehammer remains not just a great song of the 80s, but one of the greatest pop songs of all time, with one of the best, if not the best, music videos to go along with it. So happy anniversary, Sledgehammer. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.